Greetings and welcome to our next edition of Ghost Stories of Washington. Hopefully, you all are enjoying this series. We are in Chapter 1, continuing with 4 more short stories in this chapter. We're going to have Haunted Prize Winner and House Hunter and the Captain's House. An addition brings Ghost. Our first one's a very short one called The Haunted Prize Winner. According to an article in the Spokesman's Review, an award-winning historic house in Spokane was thought to have been home to a ghost, perhaps because the old Mar house had been left to deteriorate for so many years. It had developed a reputation for being haunted. Once the current owners began the restoration work that would eventually win them civic recognition, the place no longer looked nearly as spooky as it had. Despite the vastly improved appearance of the home, the owner made comments to a journalist which seemed to indicate that this was not an ordinary house, but one that had a mind of its own. During the refurbishing process, the woman explained, the goal had been to restore the building to what the house itself wanted to be. One clear indication of a preference they were given to do with color. When it came to the time to choose shades of paint, the owners got a strong indication that the house hates white. The couple acquiesced to the house's wishes, so it would seem that in this case, history is being well cared for. In our second of 4 short stories here, the next one is called House Hunter. The year was 1918, and the world's population rejoiced in celebration. The terrible carnage that was the war to end all wars had finally ended. For a time, it seemed that people could get back to doing the business of living. Tragically, what should have been was not to be. The decimation of the population continued, a dreadful epidemic of influenza, one that would leave few North American families intact, was spreading with lethal strength and speed. Once the deadly virus set out on its own course of destruction, there was nothing that could be done to stop it. Little could be done even to control its deadly rampage. The tragedy and human suffering caused by the 1918 flu epidemic would, before it was over, rival that of the war. Its victims, however, were chosen even more randomly. It was not just soldiers who were dying. No one, young or old, male or female, was safe from the disease's virulent ravages. Fritz Lee of Shaw Island was one of the fatalities. As best we can reconstruct from the scant information that has survived, Fritz was, before contacting the virus, a healthy 21 years old and much-loved son. Neither of those facts, however, could protect him. Before he had celebrated his 22nd birthday, Fritz Lee was dead. With heavy hearts, Fritz's parents buried their son just a few yards from their home in Blind Bay. Then, as best they were able, the Lees tried to get on with their lives. Nearly 40 years later, Al and Lot Wilding, the Blind Bay property's new owners, found tangible proof of that terrible burden. They discovered a collection of Fritz's letters to his mother and his old school books stashed away in the house. The discovery must have been an enlightening one. When they bought the place, the Wildings had no idea they were acquiring anything more than a recreational property. It wasn't until later that they realized that they had taken over property possessed by a ghost they came to think of as their gentle spirit. Fritz was always very accepting of probably even fond of both Al and Lot Wilding. His spirit never directly gave the Wildings any trouble. It was only the couple's guests who were occasionally startled by the resident ghost. Al's uncle was the first to experience Fritz's experience. While staying overnight during a visit with the Wildings, the uncle was sleeping in what had been Fritz's bedroom, the very room in which the young man had died. When he woke with a start, the disoriented man was certain that there was something standing near him, watching. Al's uncle opened his eyes to see who had come into the room, but he found himself alone. Only mildly concerned about the experience, the man simply rolled over and went back to sleep. A few hours later, however, the same thing happened again. The man woke up with the impression that someone was in the room with him. Again, he checked to see who might have come in, and again he found the room empty. He was sure, though, that another presence had been in the room, staring at him while he slept. Despite the disturbed sleep, Al's uncle accepted the room for a second night. The stay, however, was his last. The next morning he told his host that what had been happening throughout the night, and explained that he was no longer comfortable staying in the room. The Wildings were quick to accommodate their uncle's request for a change. They moved him to another room. Over time, the bedroom with the strange sense of an unseen presence was used less and less frequently as sleeping quarters. Eventually, it was used only for storage. Unfortunately, that change didn't stop Fritz from disturbing Wilding's guests. Two couples whom Al and Lot had invited to the island reported hearing footsteps climbing the stairs, walking along an upstairs corridor. Afraid that a burglar had somehow broken in, they investigated immediately, but found the entire second floor empty. Empty of visible souls, that is. The ghost was not always so passive. During another visitor's stay, Fritz was really quite intrusive. As the guests went about their day, they were listening to the radio, or more accurately, they were trying to listen to the radio. It was tuned to a station broadcasting rock and roll, but the guest room soon noticed that they were not listening to lively music at all, but rather to easy listening tunes. They checked the radio and discovered that the dial was no longer set to the station they had chosen. Slightly puzzled, they changed it back to the rock and roll station. Moments later, that same radio was again transmitting the softer sounds of the station that they had just tuned out. In exasperation, they stopped what they had been doing and moved the radio to the kitchen so they could see it more clearly. As the guests watched, the radio once again began broadcasting from the unwanted easy listening station. The ghost evidently did not enjoy the rock music. The kitchen figured prominently into another display of ghostly hijinks. The Wilding's daughter, who did not live with her parents on the island, watched as pots and pans had been hanging from hooks on the kitchen wall begin to move from side to side with enough force to bang each into each other. No one was visible near the utensils at this time. Although Fritz never manifested as an apparition, his existence was hard to deny. In 1987, after owning the property for nearly 30 years, the Wildings decided to sell it. When advertising the sale, they were careful to specify the house came with a gentle resident spirit. In 1990, for undocumented reasons, the new owners employed a psychic to free Fritz's soul from the dimension and to guide it to eternal rest. Presumably, the old house on Shaw Island is no longer haunted. In our third short story in this part of the chapter, the captain's house. The property and house at Gig Harbor meant everything to the sea captain. He had put his whole heart into building the big two-story home, and he eagerly anticipated the day he could retire from sailing to enjoy a more settled existence. Alas, that day never came, at least not while the captain was alive. On the voyage that proved to be his last, a piece of equipment fell from the vessel's mast, striking the sailor's head. The man's crew rushed him ashore to a hospital, but his injuries were massive and he never recovered. He died, never having enjoyed the house to which he had so looked forward to retiring. Violet and Lyle Severtson and their family did not know any of this when just at the end of World War II they moved into the house that the captain had built. They only knew that they loved the home idyllic settings of the scenic knoll amid fruit trees with a view of the harbor. After only 3 months, they also knew that there was something extremely eerie about the place and that they could not remain in the house any longer. 2 weeks later, Violet's sister Anne and her husband Chester and their 2 little boys moved into the place. All was calm and peaceful until spring, when Anne heard footsteps on the floor upstairs. Because she was certain that she was the only one home, Anne immediately investigated. She found no one and no way to account for the strange sounds. Convinced that her imagination was playing tricks on her, Anne returned to the main floor. Once again, she clearly heard the sounds of footfalls coming from the second floor. Determined to catch the prankster, Anne departed for the stairs again. She planned to make her way upstairs as quietly as possible and to wait in silence on the second floor landing until the intruder came into view. As she reached that spot, however, the curtains from the window at the landing suddenly blew inward and surrounded her, spoiling her vantage point. Making a mental note to close the window and disentangled herself as quickly as possible. The moment she did, however, she realized that there was something abnormal going on in her house. The window was shut, so it could not have been a draft that caused the curtains to envelope her like that. After thoroughly checking the upstairs of the house, assuring her that no one was there, Anne went back down to the kitchen to finish her chores. All was quiet for the rest of the morning. But she heard the phantom footsteps again that afternoon. Again she investigated, and again she found the house as empty as it should have been. Anne's concern about the situation was growing, but she did not relate the incidents to anyone else in the family. Not, that is, until her brother, his wife, and their 2 sons came to stay for the night. The little boys were to sleep in a room on the main floor of the house. The children settled in for the night without any problems. But in the middle of the night, the 2-year-old boy woke everyone in the house with his repeated screams, "That man! That man!" All of the adults except the boys and Anne were convinced that the child had suffered a nightmare. Anne did wonder what the exact cause had been, because the child was very specific about having seen a man in the living room. Perhaps it had been the same man that she had heard walking around the house some weeks before. In an attempt to coax the boy back to sleep, the family tried to encourage their dog to keep the children company. Unfortunately, the usually obedient hound simply would not enter the room. The dog's hackles were raised, and it growled menacingly at something none of the people were able to see. When their guest had gone, the McIntyres soon got back to normal. until the time their 11-year-old daughter woke in the middle of the night screaming in terror. When Anne and her daughter calmed down enough to speak, the girl told a story almost identical to the one related by her young cousin some months before. A man had been standing in the room, the child maintained. Because Anne's daughter was older than her nephew, the girl was able to give a more complete description. She insisted that the man had been wearing a dark-colored pea jacket, the kind that sailors wear, and that his head was bandaged. She also reported that he had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared. The apparition was clearly gaining strength now. It was September when Anne herself saw the image. She, too, had been asleep when something woke her. As she opened her eyes, Anne realized she was not alone. In the room, a man stood near the doorway watching her sleep. The startled woman yelled at the image, jumped out of bed, and ran to turn on the light switch. Once the glow from the fixture filled the room, Anne was alone again. This did nothing to calm her fears, however, because she realized that in order to turn on the light, she had reached right through the image of the man. The image, she now realized, was a ghost. Anne searched the entire house but could find no trace of the strange man she had seen in her room. The next morning she thoroughly checked for footprints outside, but found nothing. Anne now realized that she had to talk to her sister Violet. She needed to know why Violet's family had moved out so abruptly after living in the house for such a short time. Anne called on Violet a few days later, and soon steered the conversation toward the strange presence in the house. "You've seen him too, have you?" Violet replied. Now Anne knew her suspicions had been correct. The house was definitely haunted for reasons not related to the ghost. Anne McIntyre's family moved on, but before they did, they found tenants for the big old house. If those occupants ever saw or heard anything out of the ordinary, they kept the experience confidential. However, the new occupants did tell the McIntyres that they had been visited by the widow and daughter of the sea captain who built the house, and how Anne finally came to learn the identity of the ghost with whom she had shared her home. The original owner of the house had simply never left it. And our last in this 4 short stories in this part of chapter 1 in the book is Addition Brings Ghost. By the 1930s, the Mount Pleasant School District, located along Highway 14 near the town of Washougal, had abandoned its one-room school in favor of a more modern digs. Such a move was hardly noteworthy when you consider that the small building had served the southwestern Washington community since 1892. What was perhaps surprising was the decision not to tear down the building. The old school was sold to a family who made the necessary changes to convert it to a residence before moving in and happy calling the place home. What is even more surprising is that well-used building was not haunted. At the time, it wasn't until another house was moved onto the same lot to serve as an addition to the old school building that the family acquired a ghost. The spirit certainly displayed a distinct personality, although psychics assured the homeowners that the presence was with them year-round. He only drew attention to himself when they and their families celebrated holidays. During the Thanksgiving weekend of 1992, the owner's son-in-law was awakened in the night by a feeling of pressure on his chest. He sat up in bed with a start his eyes opening wide in near panic. Staring back at him only inches away was a disembodied set of eyes. Before the man could even scream in fright, the eyes turned away and vanished. He later realized that those had not been human eyes that held his gaze. They weren't animal-like either, but they were most definitely not human. Despite his experience that night, the man maintains that he is a skeptic. He insists with equal conviction that he will always sleep in another room when he stays with his in-laws. 2 years later, other relatives were staying at the haunted house. The gathering was again to celebrate Thanksgiving, and this time the ghost visited a woman who was sleeping in the room directly below the area where the previous visitation had occurred. This guest also woke to the feeling that there was a weight on her chest. She described it as something walking lightly over her chest. Like the owner's son-in-law, she also saw a pair of eyes staring intently at her. In a tremendous display of spirit resolve, she ordered the ghost to leave. The eyes vanished immediately. After hearing of the second similar experience in that particular section of their home, the owners decided that they needed to talk to the people from whom they had bought the house. Despite a concerted effort on the part of the homeowners, they were never able to track the couple down. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Ghost Stories of Washington as we continue going through chapter 1 with haunted houses, haunted prize winner, house hunter, the captain's house, an edition brings ghost. Hopefully you enjoy this series, and I look forward to bringing you the next episode very shortly. So again, we'll see you. Take care and have a great day. Be careful where you might look, where you might go. You might find a haunted house.